So, without further ado, I think let's get this interview rolling. To start, my name is Josh Mysore. I'm one of the co-founders of the New Journalism Collective at TNJC from Dallas, Texas, and I'm 18 years old. I edit my high school yearbook, and I'm really excited to introduce our guest today, Mr. Craig Robinson from NBC Universal. If you want to just go ahead and introduce yourself.
Sure, great. Thank you, Josh. I'm Craig Robinson. I am the Executive Vice President and Chief Diversity Officer at NBC Universal. I will not bore you with with my bio. I'm sure that if you're having a look at this, you may have taken a second to go ahead and Google me, and that explains the job. But as you can imagine from the title Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, I work across the company to, I think to put it in the simplest terms, to make sure that our workforce and our content and our culture reflect the world in which we live.
Great. Okay. So let's kind of start with a basic question, I would say, just to get to know more about you.
Sure.
Today's topic is going to center around the idea of diversity and the 21st century, and especially related to our generation, Generation Z. However, I feel like the audience and I would like to get to know you a little better. So according to NBC Universal's website, you credit a large sum of your public service interests nowadays to your upbringing in Echo Park and with your family. So I want to talk about your racial identity, your beginnings here in America, and how that's contributed kind of to your professional stature nowadays.
Well, it's one of my favorite things to talk about because in this role, and I've been in this role for 9 years, it feels like my career has kind of come full circle to where it belonged. Because for many, many years, I worked running television stations. I worked managing sales departments, which sold commercial airtime for local television stations. And those were really fun, exciting jobs. And yet, I didn't always feel the personal satisfaction that I was doing something that could be seen as positively influencing the world. And my parents both worked in public service all their lives. And so they dedicated their careers to doing things that improve people's lives. So there was always a little bit of a disconnect in that regard. Mm-hmm. So to have, after now what is almost a 40-year career, to be able to be in this role and to be, I think, affecting change and doing good is very, very satisfying. My mother is Chinese American. She is the daughter of a woman who was born in China. My grandmother, my papa, was from Guangzhou, China. Was in an arranged marriage, so it wasn't so long ago that was that. Well, and in some cultures, of course, still happening. It wasn't so long ago that was happening in our family line. And my mother was born in LA's Chinatown and raised in LA's Chinatown. She was working at the LA County Courthouse, married to a Chinese American man. When my father, who was black, he passed away 10 years ago. When my father was also working in the LA County Courthouse, and when they met in Los Angeles. My father came from the Midwest and was living in Los Angeles, one of the many places he lived. So we're talking about the late 50s here. And I know that's probably almost impossible for some of you to even think about, and I'm in fact older than probably most of your parents, or maybe all of your parents, and maybe even some of your grandparents. But the concept of biracial relationships, while even in some places are not universally accepted, was really a tough concept, even in Los Angeles in the late 50s. So my mother she was divorced from her Chinese American husband and met my father, and they married. Now remember, my maternal grandmother came from China. So she came from a country where everybody was one race. So I would say that, and she was a wonderful woman, and I still think about her every day. She's been gone for many years, but she grew up on a farm and was not educated and did not have a great deal of sophistication in that regard. So the concept of her daughter marrying somebody who was anything but Chinese or Chinese American was not something she welcomed. So my parents were an interracial couple in the late 50s, early 60s, and were looking for a house. And this goes back, Josh, to what you talked about. So many of my earliest memories inform my understanding of inequality today, even today, maybe perhaps I could even say especially today in some ways. But it's those early experiences that you don't often even realize you're making an impression on you that do so. But my parents, I ended up living in Echo Park, as you mentioned, which, if you know Los Angeles, it's kind of it's a very hip area now. It was not considered a hip area then. It's kind of like what's happened to Brooklyn in New York. It's one of the hot neighborhoods. But when I grew up there, it was not a hot neighborhood. It was a very middle class neighborhood and also a very Hispanic neighborhood, but many races, multicultural. One of the reasons we ended up in Echo Park is because my parents were having a difficult time purchasing a house. Because in the early 60s, still, it was written into many deeds that you could not sell to a Black person because they were trying to preserve home values. So there are some neighborhoods that were simply off limits to them. And in some cases, people simply wouldn't sell to them because they were going to sell to an interracial couple. So my parents ended up buying a house from a lesbian couple. So we're talking about early 60s. And I bring that up because I don't remember this, obviously, I was very little. But what I imagine is that this lesbian couple who had their own struggles took a look at my parents and saw a couple that was struggling also with being discriminated against and an outsider. And this kind of brings us to this term intersectionality and allyship. Right. Really, that many underrepresented groups share some of these same struggles and the power and the importance of all pulling together. We could talk a little more about that later. But I grew up in a neighborhood that was extremely multicultural. So I grew up on a street where there were lots of single parents, again, early 60s, not that common, a number of interracial couples, a number of members of the LGBTQ community. I think there were four gay and lesbian couples on our street. So that was my reality in the early 60s. So when I got out into the world and it didn't look exactly like that, I was surprised because I had found this cocoon where I was allowed to live sort of among other people that were like me and not feel like an outsider. And as a biracial, child, and then a youth, also a member of the LGBTQ community, that was enormously important to me. And now when I think back so often, and I think about opportunities that people have and discrimination that people face, I think back to my early childhood. And it really does help me keep moving forward and inform my views on this. And also, in some ways, it inspires me, and in other ways, it makes me sad that we are still dealing with so many of the same things that my parents were dealing with, almost 60 years ago.
I actually want to ask a follow-up question to you. You mentioned the LGBTQ community, and I'm going to cite this here. You were featured in an interview with Hollywood Reporter in 2014 regarding going to the Sochi Olympics, I believe, in Russia, as an LGBTQ representative.
Yeah.
So kind of stemming, from that burgeoning area in childhood where you were surrounded by so many people from different walks of life. How do you see your role nowadays, especially with your position at NBC Universal, domestically, internationally, whatever it may be, in representing the LGBTQ community? And is there anything specific you can say? I just kind of free reign here.
Yeah. I feel, and I don't want to sound overly grandiose, because that's not what I mean to say, but I do feel a responsibility to be a voice, not the voice, because I don't certainly speak for everybody who's LGBTQ or everybody who's Black or everybody who's Asian American, because these are not monolithic groups, I mean, as we know. But I do feel a responsibility to be a voice that isn't sometimes heard in some of the rooms in which I sit. When you mentioned Sochi, one of the reasons that was important for me to go was because at the time, as you may recall, Putin had passed some pretty strict anti-LGBTQ laws. And there was an outcry in the community that the games should not be there.
Right.
And the IOC and the USOC were under pressure to say, do not reward this city, which is making a very strong stand against human rights, in this case LGBTQ rights, and do not allow them to be a place that is convening people from all over the world that is supposed to be a symbol of unity. And of course, what we know is it's not that simple. It takes, these cities are identified many years out. There's an infrastructure that's built, and you can't just say, okay, we're going to now move it to another city.
Right.
So it became very important to me as I sat for the year, 2 years that I was sitting in my boss's, who was the CEO of the company, staff meetings, as we were talking about how the community was pressuring us and what we were going to do about it. I knew pragmatically that we were not going to change venues, but what became important to me is, okay, the eyes of the world are going to be on Sochi. Let's use that platform to inform. Because if we pull away, we've just taken the bright light that we have an opportunity to shine on a problem away. By us pulling out of there, that doesn't mean that LGBTQ people are going to now suddenly get their rights back. Now, actually, there's no attention being paid to it. So I was proud to bring that up over and over again. I was proud that our sports team completely understood the importance of this. And I was proud to be sitting in the booth on the first night before opening ceremonies when there was an interview between Bob Costas, who was the Olympic host at the time, when he talked to a leading Russian expert, and he said, I'm just going to put it right on the table. Talk about these laws. Talk about what's going on here. Talk about why those are right or wrong, and talk about what that means to the rest of the world. What are we to think of your country when some of these laws seem archaic and draconian? And I'll never forget, I was sitting there and the producer, they had the interview, and I was like, wow, that is powerful. They were pre-recording it, and he turned around and he said, what do you think? And I said, I think that's great, because we have hundreds of millions of people watching this, and we just talked about it.
Right. So
that's sort of the responsibility that I feel. And I know that in many ways, people think that, look, I'm the child of activists. I was out marching against Vietnam as soon as with my parents, as soon as they could get me out there. So I believe in protest. I believe in peaceful protest. But there are many ways to get things done. Some people embrace boycotts. I think boycotts can sometimes be effective. But I also know that being an internal voice can be one of the most effective places, because if you're rallying against something from outside, they can choose or not choose to listen to. When I'm sitting at that table among other executives making what I hope they consider to be a valid point from someone they've learned to respect as a fellow executive, that's how I think change is made. So I never want to lose the chance to speak up on behalf of any group. I mean, a small example I'll give you is that I've been asked to do lots of panels, diversity panels, over the past few months, because this is the world in which we're living. All these panels are virtual. And I've been on 3 in the past 2 months, where at the pre-call, I sat down with the other panelists, and I noticed that there was no Hispanic representation on the panel. And so I'd say, excuse me, is this a Black Lives, and I was being ingenuous. I said, is this a Black Lives Matters panel, or is this, and they said, no, it's a diversity panel. And I said, well, how can it be a diversity panel if you don't have a Hispanic representative? That's 20% of our country. If you don't have that voice, you have API, you have Black, you have, you know, in some cases Indigenous, but very often it was primarily Black panelists. And I said, we can't. No, in one case I pulled out of the panel because I said I can't endorse this. In the second case, I have a member of my team who is Hispanic at a vice president level, who is a great panelist. I said, you're coming in, I'm stepping out. And in the third one, they went and they found a fantastic Hispanic panelist to speak. But I said, gosh, how can you be putting together a diversity panel and nobody noticed that glaring omission? So, I mean, it is up to us to speak at every point, even when it oftentimes feels awkward and uncomfortable. Don't miss the opportunity to make that point. It's important.
Right. And in talking about, talking about the things that make us uncomfortable, right? At NBCU, I take it that you do a lot of work with external organizations and partnering. I think you work with 9 or 10. You can correct me as you follow. What type of organization do you look for? What type of organization, when you're at the helm, doing your line of work, what do you look for in a group that's really promoting a good narrative for a specific group, whether it be ethnicity, race, LGBTQ group, whatever it may be? What do you look for in a strong organization?
And you're talking about like external advocacy groups?
Right.
Yeah. I think I look for purity of purpose. And by that, what I mean is, and we have to do our research because there are thousands of groups out there.
Yes.
And who, if you go to their website and take a look at the mission statement, sounds like, okay, that sounds like something we'd want to embrace, but you have to dig a little deeper because not every group, you can't take every group at face value. So is their mission pure? Also, just practically, are their financials in order? And there are ways you can check that. There are all kinds. There's charity watches, all kinds of ways to have a look. Because are these people that are responsibly if we're going to partner with them, and by partnering with them, sort of put the NBC Universal name on the line, right. Are we sure that we're working with people who are fiscally responsible? Not to say that they're deliberately criminal, but are they responsible? Because if we're going to support them either with our money or with our time, is this a well-run organization? Because if it's not a well-run organization, then we should not be spending our time with them. What is their long-term view? Do they have a view on, again, intersectionality? Certainly we need groups that are focused on Black issues and on Asian American issues and LGBTQ issues and Indigenous issues and disabilities issues. But are they looking at those issues also through an intersectional lens? Because for so many of us, we do live in many different worlds, or if we don't, we are probably no more than one person away from someone who lives in one of those worlds, whether through a family member or a spouse or a boyfriend or a girlfriend. So is this a group that that has a large understanding of the world community? So those are the things that, and I think, and I should have said this first, does their culture align with what's important to our culture? I mean, so that's really number one, because if not, then, we need to move on and look for someone else.
What is NBCU Universal's culture?
Well, I would like to say, well, first of all, what I would say is that anytime you give a sort of a culture and mission statement, you're going to have people who say, really? Are you really that? So what I would say is that this is what we strive to be, and there are always areas in which we can be better. And we're a big company. Yeah. So not every single pocket of a company that's 35,000 people and is global is going to feel the same way to every employee because it's a big company with lots of locations. But we definitely want to be a company who is proud of the product that we produce, that is offering the opportunity for multiple perspectives. And that's both in information and news as well as storytelling. And We are committed to, and again, I say this guardedly because in today's polarized world, people will say, "Oh, I don't believe that. My parents don't believe that." I'd like to. I believe that our news organization is committed to telling truth, factual news. There are those who disagree, but that's something that I know is important to our newsroom, journalistic integrity. And then on the culture standpoint for employees, it needs to be a place, and this is where we are still working on this, as is all of corporate America, where people feel welcome, where people feel valued, where people feel that they can succeed, that they're not going to be held back by any characteristics, whether it be gender or race or gender identity or sexual orientation. And all those things, and where they can, and this is a cliched term, but it's a cliche because there's a reason cliches exist, because it really matters, where they can bring their full selves to the office and to their work. Because I think a very good example of this is the LGBTQ world. If you think about someone who is coming to work, so let me back up a bit. If you are Black in the workplace, it's obvious to your coworkers that you are Black. If you're a member of the LGBTQ community in the workplace, sometimes it is not obvious. And so it's often a choice that one makes whether to share that about themselves or not. So when people are working in an environment where they are concerned that either their career would be endangered by being publicly out, or where they just don't feel comfortable in their work unit because people would make them feel self-conscious. What I always say to people is that being closeted, and I'm fortunate in that I came out my very first year at CBS when I was 21, not even knowing the potential risks or how freeing that is. But when I work with people who have been closeted for 20, 30 years, and when they come out, the day you see them after they come out, they look 20 years younger and like they've just had the weight of the world lifted from their shoulders, because they're using so many of their cognitive resources to hide who they are and to make sure that they haven't slipped on a pronoun when they're describing their roommate, or that they haven't inadvertently given away how they spent their vacation with their girlfriend or boyfriend when really they keep talking about just friends. It takes a lot of work to keep track of lies like that. And what I say to people is that is not good for the individual, and it's not good for the organization, because those cognitive resources can be used for work, because work is hard enough.
Right.
But when someone's trying to keep the other stuff straight, you're not getting the best work out of them. So it's tremendously important to have an environment where people can come in and like, okay, good. You don't care that I live with a man. You don't care that I live with a woman. You don't care. It's enormously freeing, and that's the kind of company that I love. That those tenets I give you are a few of the tenets that I hope that most people feel that we are, and that if we aren't in some cases, that we're working towards that.
I love that last sentiment that you just shared about just the faculties and how we need to focus on, the right things, which is just being a team in a workplace rather than having to combat our feeling not safe in a space. So I love that. Talking about feeling safe in a space, it's a great segue into talking about the notion of what an affinity group is. These are very prevalent at colleges across America, and now in several high schools. And we see this trickle down. It started in companies, it's moved to college, or you could say it started in colleges. It started and now it's spreading, right? However, there are still organizations that exist who will say that, we don't use affinity groups because it promotes segregation of ideas, or, there's varying perspectives on it. Given your expertise in the field, what are your thoughts on the role of an affinity group? And to those, and based on your opinion, what would you say to those who disagree with you?
Well, Josh, as you know, I feel very strongly about this, and it's over this topic that you and I first met at JCAM. Because you came right up to me and asked me this question, and to your credit, you a year later came after me and said, I want to keep talking about that, because I could not be more clear, my personal view, nor unequivocal in supporting the notion of affinity groups, or as we call them, employee resource groups, but it would be in a high school or a college, would be an affinity group, for a number of reasons. So let me start with this notion of that they are exclusionary. And I've had employees say to me, why does your department support groups that are saying, oh, here's the Black group, here's the Hispanic group? You're supposed to be in the inclusivity officer, aren't you saying, go ahead and segregate? I say a couple of things to that. One, I'm not coming anywhere and saying, okay, we're going to form a Black group, and we're going to form a Hispanic group, we're going to form it. Employees come to us.
Right.
These employee-driven groups. They are employee staffed. I mean, we support them financially, and I have somebody on my team who helps sort of manage the overall, because we have 9 groups and we have membership of about 16,000. And I'm going to come back to that point because it answers your question in a second. And we have somebody who manages it, but we rely on the employees to run them. So employees are saying to us, look, I know we're supposed to be living in this post-racial world where everybody can just get along and color, no one sees color and blah, blah, blah. But I think we all know, Josh, that that's not true. And I don't think we have to look farther than our television to know that that's not true. Or maybe our school, or maybe our neighborhood. Because I think if you look at statistics, and you'll know this better than I, we're actually more segregated today than I think we ever have been. When you take a look, and it's not because people say you can't live here because you are this color. It's because of economics, which is an entirely different, topic for us to explore. But economics have still created this divide between opportunity for, the opportunity gap still exists for many ethnic and many races. I mean, let's just be honest. And if you haven't read the case for reparations, that was the New York Times. I'm sure you have, of course. You probably could have written it, for God's sake. That's one of the best pieces I've ever read. But I mean, you are so in tune in this. And I say to anybody, don't read it through the lens of whether or not you're pro or con reparations, because that to me is that's a separate conversation. But it was through that lens that this was written. And as you know, having read it, the data are heart-wrenching. The number that when they talk about the disparity between Black wealth and other groups, it breaks your heart. It helps you understand so much of the inequality.
One look at redlining confirms that.
That's right.
I agree, and continue.
So there are people still who want to be, first of all, they want to be around other people who share their experience. It doesn't mean they don't want to be around other people, but they want, living as a woman, because we have a women's affinity group, employee resource, is different in the workplace than it is to be a man. Being a Black employee is different than it is to be a Hispanic employee. Let's not deny that. Let's not act like all of our experiences are the same. I mean, I think that's very quixotic. Maybe 100 years from now, that will be the case, but right now it is not. So people still feel a comfort sometimes in coming together. And the other super important thing is, and this is what non-diverse people often miss, it creates a safe space where people can have honest conversations and say things to each other that they maybe wouldn't say in the classroom or to their boss for fear of reprisals. Things come out of, I get feedback out of our employee resource groups that I would not otherwise hear, that are sometimes issues in the workplace that need to be addressed. But because we've created this safe space, it has enabled people to come forward. And the other thing that people forget is that they can say, look, if you want to organize a group on your own, that's fine. We're not going to prohibit it. Maybe that's missing the point entirely. When a Comcast or an NBC Universal says, we are sanctioning and funding an official group dedicated to people with disabilities, veterans, women, LGBTQ, that imbues it with a legitimacy and an importance that's different than an ad hoc group coming together. So and the other thing I'll tell you is that we have probably 10,000, I think, 8 to 10,000 individual employees who are active members. But we have 16,000 or more, membership of 16,000 or more, because people belong to multiple groups. Now, either they organically are a woman and a Black woman and perhaps a member of the LGBTQ community, so they're joining all three. But in some cases, people are joining groups as allies. This is the other thing people miss. All of our groups are expressly designed for people with disabilities and their allies, the LGBTQ community and their allies, our Black employees and their allies. And I think people miss that opportunity. And then going back to something I said earlier, why wouldn't a man want to join the Women's Network? I'm guessing that man has a woman in his life, whether it be his mother, perhaps a spouse, many times a daughter, who he wants to see succeed in the workplace. When she gets in the workplace, why wouldn't he be interested in seeing what the Women's Network is doing to advance women's careers at NBC Universal? So this notion that it has to be about you, I think is problematic. It is, I find these groups absolutely unifying rather than exclusionary. But I do think it is often hard for people who are not members of any underrepresented group to understand that, because if you are in this society a straight white male, and I mean nothing against straight white males, so don't get me wrong, but if you're a straight white male, there are probably not that many rooms, or in our case, meetings, where you have found yourself to be uncomfortable or outnumbered. But if you're a Latina or a Black vice president in many companies in corporate America, there are many times when you are the only person in so many meetings. You're there and expected to represent for all Black people, and you are one of the others. So if you've never been a member of the other, I think it's hard to imagine why people who are not part of that majority group would feel the need to be together. But that to me is quite honestly a blind spot. And so it has to be explained to people. And some people, even when having it explained, will not agree with it. Right. But as you can tell, I am passionate about this. And it's not an accident that when external companies do an analysis of corporate America and they talk about, are they great places to work? They look at things like, do they offer, is there pay equity, and what are their benefits like? And, is there childcare? And on the list is, do they have employee resource groups? So there's a wide body of research that proves that employee resource groups improve company culture. I would offer that it's not too much of a leap to think that that affinity groups in high schools would then, or junior high, would then also contribute to the culture of the school. But I'm not an educator, and I don't know the particular ins and outs of why that might not be right. But it seems to me that affinity groups should be something that should be looked at as, strangely enough or counterintuitively, inclusionary and not exclusionary.
Right. Actually, I have an interesting question for you. And this came through conversation with a friend of mine. He is Lithuanian, and he came to the United States. And one thing he mentioned to me was, when the whole premise of a straight white male is brought up, he feels a little underrepresented, because in his experience, he has not contributed at all to the American stereotype of what a white male is. Instead, he just, he moved from Europe, and he told me, I feel like I've been placed into this boat without having ever even set sail. and I didn't have an answer. I mean, this isn't my domain of expertise, and I'm not asking for an answer from you. But if you were me, what would you say in response to that?
Well, so he brings up, he brings up a really great point, and I love that you brought that up because there are layers, and when I use the example, straight white male, and I don't want to make it seem too facile. I'm just saying that when we think about corporate America and CEOs and people who we generally see in positions of power, I'd say overwhelmingly they are straight white males. I mean that's all it is a fact, not, and I'm not judging it. It's just a fact of what the world looks like. But that's a very interesting point. Did he come over here as a young man?
He came over here when he was relatively young, yes.
Okay, but I mean, okay, so like as a young child, he has an overlay of the immigrant experience.
Right.
So that automatically sort of, I think, that's a part of his identity that is an otherness that someone whose family has been here for 6 generations wouldn't feel.
Right.
So I think that gives him a complexity that his counterpart, who is not an immigrant, wouldn't have. So I can understand why he's saying, like, wait a minute, this is not my construct.
Right.
I got here and now I'm kind of living in your world. His point is very well taken. So, but I think what is a little different, perhaps, that he may or may not be seeing, and I don't know how he identifies, and it doesn't in terms of sexual orientation, it doesn't really matter. But the point that I would make is that, again, that would be something that he would choose to disclose.
Right.
Because what you often hear from women in business, Black employees, Hispanic employees to some degree, Asian Americans certainly, is like, okay, so you, member of the LGBTQ community, you get to choose who knows. I'm Black.
Right. When
I walk into a room, I'm Black. So I am dealing with everything that comes with that. So please realize there's a difference, is what you often hear from communities of color. There's a difference between your struggle and mine. They're all real, but they're different. And right. So I think in his case, if I were to meet him, and I don't know how old he was when he moved here, if he has an accent or whatever, I wouldn't necessarily know that he had that immigrant overlay and all that comes with it from being, I'm guessing, the child of parents who were raised in Lithuania, right? Yeah, which comes with the whole other cultural overlay, which makes him, which makes him different. Yes, you're right. But it's funny that he's looking at that and saying, "Wait a minute, that's not me. Don't blame me for this."
Right. I thought it was a good observation, and to be honest, I mean, I'm a high schooler. I hear what kids say about affinity groups, and sometimes the question is like, can we use like a broad term to label people who are in not positions of power, but advantageous perspectives, positions, within the framework of America. So I wanted to bring that up. And I guess a good question jumping off of that is just to touch on tokenism in general. Recently, I've seen a lot of schools, especially with the Black Lives Matter movement gaining prevalence, by the day, in this 2020 year. A lot of schools have seen students send letters to the administration saying, hey, look what's happening in the US. Maybe we should be looking at our school. Is there something amiss? Is there something we could be doing better? And a lot of people ask for seeing people of color or people of different backgrounds in administrative positions. So where do we draw the line of equal representation, or maybe equal isn't the right word to use, adequate, versus tokenism saying, well, we need to have a diverse administration. So let's find a candidate from X background to place in Y position. Where do we draw that line?
First of all, people need to be looking at this as a long-term journey, not a quick fix. Because what these students, I believe, are asking for, and probably not, I don't think they mean next week, but why when I'm filling in the blank here, why when I look at the administration of my school do I see primarily, or just a terrible lack of representation among people of color. It's not reflective of our community, it's not reflective of the world, etc. What I think they're really saying is, well, I don't know what they're saying. I'll tell you what I'm saying, but I'm going to take a look at that. What I would say is, if I came back next year and 50% of those, and now you were at 50% or 60% or 70% of people of color, and you did that in a matter of months, I'd want to take a look at how that process transpired. Because if you went from having almost no diversity to having so much diversity, that would concern me, because were you making the right choices, or were you doing quotas, and were you actually putting people in roles saying, okay, we need a Latina, okay, now we need an Asian American. Now we need that, because that's not how we approach it at NBC Universal. That's not how anyone should approach it, because that's a rush to fulfill a number and to check a box. But what I would say for the long term, and what I say to our business leaders is, take a look at your organization and what are your opportunities? And look, and you have 10 great people who work for you, and you need, and this is all hypothetical, right? And you have, 2 people of color out of the 10, and that doesn't, and 1 woman. So no, I'm not saying to you that you need to fire 3 people to make spots to then put people in that are women or people of color. I'm saying to you, when that next opening comes, how are you going to go about filling it? Or and the best way to answer that is, how did you fill the last 3 positions that you filled? Because if the way you filled the last 3 positions was you went and you looked at your network of people that you've worked with before, or that you know from your neighborhood, or who you play sports with, or whatever, if you're pulling from this same network, you're probably not going to have, the group's not going to look real different in 3 years. Oh. You need to be interviewing and expanding your network of who you are considering for the job. I never say to somebody, your next hire needs to be X. What I will say is, in your next interview panel, you need to have qualified, great candidates who are both female or ethnically diverse as part of the panel. Because if you didn't do that the past 3 times, no wonder you don't have any diversity now. Always hire the best person. Great point. But if you don't have anybody in your network, avail yourselves of people that do. There are plenty of organizations that can help you with that. So think about how you're going to fill the next position. And the next position still might be a person who's not diverse. Never, I always say this, never put a person into a role because of a specific characteristic. Because if you take someone who you are placing in a position who may not, through no fault of their own, have had enough experience quite yet to be in that position, maybe they're a year or 2 from that, just because of lack of opportunity. But if you say, I'm going to fast track him or her because we need an X, and you put them in that position, you have done 2 major disservices. Right. You've done a disservice to the organization because they weren't the best person. And you've done a disservice to the individual because they may not have the necessary tools to succeed. And then when they don't succeed, that's a high profile, diverse failure. So you need to look at, I think that what I hope the students are saying is, take a look at how you're hiring people and why it always looks the same, and what can be done from a process standpoint to expand the universe of candidates that you're looking at, so that in 2 years' time, or 3 years' time, or 5 years' time, you have a plan for who, for increasing diversity. And one of the ways that we are encouraging, that corporate America has found to do that is, and I think it may be the same in academia and at schools, we're encouraging our executives to be interviewing all year long, interviewing people who are interesting all year long. Because if you wait until you have a position open and you're in a rush to fill the position, because in corporate America, if you leave a position open for 6 months, it's very likely the boss will come to you and say, if you got away with it for 6 months, why do you need that job? We're going to take that headcount away. So everyone's like, let me hurry up and fill this job. So when you do that, if you're going to rush to fill a job, what are you going to do? You're probably going to call upon your known network and not take the time to go outside of your network. And it does take more time. So if you're interviewing all year long and meeting people all throughout the year, then when you have an unexpected or expected position open, you think, I talked to Josh in February. He wasn't very happy where he was at the time, but we didn't have an opening. Let me go back and see. So you need to be doing this all year long, because if you wait till that minute, it's too late. Because you're going to go hire somebody you already know, and somebody who you already know may very well kind of look like you.
I go to an all boys school for an example, and inherently, if I had to quickly reach out to like people for an opening, it would be mainly guys, because my close friends and acquaintances are guys.
Right.
That in itself is not me saying I don't want to work with a woman, but what's happening is I'm choosing a select group.
It's just a fact. There's nothing wrong with it. It doesn't make you a bad person. It's just what it is. When we are trying to increase diversity, equity, and inclusion, I guess the key word I'd say is we must be deliberate about it. So you would have to be deliberate. If somebody said to you, "Hey, who should we incorporate? We're forming this club, Josh. Who should join?" Be mostly guys. You'd have to be deliberate about thinking, okay, who can we add to this? What women, what girls, what women do I know that could be added to this? So it takes deliberateness, and people sometimes are embarrassed to say, actually, I know there are talented people of color in marketing. I don't know any, because they think that makes them look like a weak leader. Actually, that's a strong leader. It's like, okay, no judgment. Then let's find you some great candidates to interview. But it's, so many of these topics are sensitive and uncomfortable. And people are terribly afraid of saying the wrong thing and what's the right terminology. And so instead, they don't say anything. And that's, the worst thing of all.
You've hinted upon this idea of talk about the uncomfortable throughout this talk. And I want to go and extend that further to this whole idea of American democracy, broad term, but just the whole idea of a democratic process, and especially kind of with my generation. We have, and I'm sure, kids my age know this, we have TikTok, Instagram, Snapchat, Twitter. It's a whole inundation of content 24/7. You go to school, your friends talk about something on Instagram, you're talking about sports. There's millions of Instagram accounts, some featuring news, sports, whatever it might be. So my overarching question, and I think a really good culminating point to this whole conversation about diversity, about, socioeconomic status, about improving a space so that everyone feels welcome, is just talking about how do we, now that we're growing up with all this content around us, with all this overwhelming feeling of like, these are all the terminologies going, this is what's happening in politics, a bomb went off in whatever place, with all this stuff going on every second in our lives. How can we calm down? How can we look at the facts? And how can we make our own informed opinions? How do we preserve our democracy?
Oh man. Well, let me tell you, if I had the answer to that, I'm not sure what I'd be doing if I had the answer to that, but people would be very anxious to hear that answer.
Oh yes, I'm not saying you have to have one, but yeah.
Here, I think there are a couple of kernels. I am not that wise, so I don't have the full-on answer. But there are a couple of kernels that I think you're right. This is kind of a good way to sort of wrap up the conversation. I have a couple of kernels that I would say. I think that people, millennials and people your age, can tend to get, and particularly perhaps your age, Gen Z, tend to get a bad rap on not differentiating between what's real, what's fake, conspiracy theories versus the facts, everything else. And of course, the internet has made all of those things available. Whereas when I was growing up, you couldn't really lay your hands on anything that was truly designed to be satirical fake news. I mean, I had Mad Magazine, which no one who's watching this will have ever heard of, but it was deliberate satire. There's a very long Wikipedia listing, and there are a lot of dedicated followers. But it was a deliberately satirical magazine, but it was so obviously satirical. But I think that your generation gets is often said, isn't being wise about what's real and what isn't. I actually think that's unfair. I don't think that has to do with your age. I think that there are people, I know there are people my age who are much less informed than people in your high school, and who are embracing truly fake news even in the face of everything else, science, everything else that tells them otherwise. So youth and ignorance, don't go together necessarily. Ignorance is rampant. So I guess what I'd say to you is that I think that, and it crosses all age groups. So my hope in your generation in preserving democracy is, and I think that your school is because I know you go to a terrific school. Not every person has that opportunity, but I'm counting on the young people who have that opportunity to work very hard to ferret out the truth. And I want to be clear, that is not a political statement, because there are conservative truths and there are liberal truths.
Right.
So but it does need to be true. And I think that there is increased tolerance today for a variety of reasons for thinking that lying is okay. Even when we can say, well, wait. That's actually not what you said 3 days ago. So it comes in like, you're going to believe me or your lying eyes. We cannot have that tolerance for untruths, because that will eventually unfold our democracy, because there must be things in which we can believe and on which we can count to hold together. I mean, I know that sounds sort of romantic and overly dramatic, but I do truly believe that. So I think seeking out the truth, and calling out untruths when you see them. You also need to be truth tellers.
Yeah.
But again, I don't blame young people for that.
Oh man, yeah. And we do get a bad rep sometimes. That's what it is,
Well, every young group does. I mean, there has to be somebody that us old people, are blaming stuff on, So it's just the way it goes. And in 40 years, or 50 years, you'll be doing the same thing. You'll be doing the same thing, looking at whatever that generation is called, and saying, "God, really?"
Oh man. Okay. Well, I think that pretty much wraps up the recorded part of this interview. We'll just stay for like a minute after just to discuss how it went.
Sure.
But thank you for the audience tuning in. I think this was a great conversation. Hit a lot of great points. Do you have anything final to add?
No, look, Josh, I just want to tell you that I love, as you know, I love meeting the group at J Camp. Again, there's no surer way to sound old than to say this, but it makes me, it inspires me that we are going to be okay when I see young people like you who are so dedicated and so passionate and really involved and so tenacious. I mean, again, you kept my information. We communicated once or twice, and then you wanted to come back on this affinity group thing. And then like 8 months later, you popped back up again. And I was like, you're like, hey, I've been really busy in school, but let's not forget. So I love that you kept at it. Mm-hmm. And I just appreciate that you invited me to talk to a group of young people. And I hope some of what I said, at least even if you disagree with me, made you think about why you disagree.
Goodness, nailed it. Nailed the ending. Yeah. Okay.
All right.